Have you ever woken up in the morning and found yourself paralyzed for 10 minutes trying to choose what to wear? Not that paralysis of being in a rush, but that strange feeling that among dozens of options in your closet, none seem right. You open the food delivery app, and after 20 minutes scrolling through hundreds of restaurants, you end up ordering the same thing as always. You sit down to choose a movie on Netflix, spend an hour browsing through thousands of titles, and in the end, give up and go to sleep. If you've lived through this, you've experienced one of the cruelest paradoxes of our era. The more freedom of choice we have, the more enslaved by those choices we become. This is a prison we built with our own hands, brick by brick, each brick an additional option that promised us more happiness and delivered more anxiety. The great irony is that our medieval ancestors, who had perhaps 3 career options, 2 types of clothing, and a single dinner dish, may have been freer than us, who have access to infinite possibilities, but discover that infinite possibilities can be a sophisticated form of torture. For thousands of years, humanity dreamed of freedom. Our ancestors looked to the horizon and imagined a world where they could freely choose their destinies, their professions, their partners, their beliefs. Slaves dreamed of liberation. Serfs dreamed of escaping the feudal lord's land. Women dreamed of choosing their own lives. Freedom was humanity's purest dream, the ultimate goal of all social and political progress. Every revolution, every liberation movement, every struggle for human rights had as its final objective to give us more choices, more options, more possible paths, and we succeeded. Oh, how we succeeded. Today we have more freedoms than any previous generation in human history. We can choose our careers among thousands of professions that didn't even exist 50 years ago. We can travel anywhere in the world in a matter of hours. We can instantly connect with billions of people. We can access virtually all human knowledge with a few taps on the screen. We can customize every aspect of our lives, from breakfast to our romantic partners, whom we now find through algorithms that offer us millions of options. We conquered freedom so completely that our ancestors could barely comprehend the universe of possibilities at our disposal. But then something strange happened. On the way to this paradise of free choice, we discovered that having infinite options didn't make us infinitely happy. On the contrary, psychological studies began to reveal that people with more options often feel more anxious, more dissatisfied, and more regretful of their decisions. Psychologist Barry Schwartz documented this phenomenon he called the paradox of choice, demonstrating that supermarkets with 60 types of jam leave consumers more frustrated than supermarkets with only 3 options. When we have 3 options, we choose one and move on. When we have 60 options, we become paralyzed by the possibility of making the wrong choice. And even after choosing, we remain tormented thinking about all the alternatives we rejected. This discovery was like a slap in the face to 3 centuries of Enlightenment philosophy. It turns out that more freedom doesn't always result in more happiness. In fact, it can result in more suffering. Choice, which should have been our liberation, became our new prison. And this prison has very peculiar characteristics. It has no visible bars or armed guards. Instead, it imprisons us with chains made of infinite possibilities. Every morning, we wake up not to the comforting certainty of a pre-established routine, but to the crushing burden of having to decide everything again, which career to pursue among thousands of possibilities, which course to take among tens of thousands available online, which city to choose to live in when we can work remotely from anywhere, which person to choose to relate to when apps give us access to millions of profiles, which personality to adopt when we can reinvent our identity on social media at any moment, which belief to embrace when we have access to all the world's philosophies and religions. Each of these decisions carries the terrible weight of all the unchosen alternatives. Every path taken is haunted by the ghosts of all the paths we decided not to take. And how do we know we're making the right choices? How can we be sure that our chosen life is better than the dozens of other lives we could be living? We can't. And this uncertainty becomes a constant anxiety that accompanies us in every decision, no matter how small. Digital technology not only multiplied our options, but made visible the alternative lives we could be living. Before, when you chose to become a teacher in a small town, you simply were a teacher in a small town. You didn't find out daily about the glamorous lives your schoolmates were living in distant metropolises. You didn't receive constant updates about alternative careers you could have pursued. Today, through social media, we are constantly bombarded with visual evidence of all the lives we're not living. We see posts from the friend who moved to Bali and works as a digital nomad. We see photos of the former colleague who became a multinational executive. We see stories of the acquaintance who dropped everything and became a chef. Each of these alternative lives we see on screens is a painful reminder of a choice we didn't make, a path we didn't take. And since these alternative lives always seem more interesting and fulfilling than our own life seen from the inside, we develop a syndrome we could call chronic envy of possibilities. We become addicted to imagining how our life would be different if we had made other choices, and this constant fantasy with parallel lives prevents us from being fully present in the life we actually chose to live. But the trap becomes even more sophisticated when we realize that many of our free choices are actually the product of algorithmic manipulation. The same systems that offer us infinite options are simultaneously shaping which options we see and how we see them. Instagram's algorithm decides which alternative lives you'll see today to feed your dissatisfaction. YouTube's algorithm decides which alternative careers will seem more attractive. The dating app's algorithm decides what type of partner will seem available. Google's algorithm decides which online courses will appear when you search for career change. In other words, our sense of having infinite choices is carefully cultivated by systems that profit by keeping our attention through constant dissatisfaction. The more dissatisfied we are with our current choices, the more time we spend online looking for alternatives, the more ads we see, the more money these systems make. The free choice industry has also become the perpetual dissatisfaction industry. We are free to choose, but only among the options that algorithms decide to show us, and these options are selected not to make us happier, but to keep us more engaged. What makes this manipulation particularly pernicious is that it operates through perfect simulation of authentic freedom. Algorithms don't tell us directly what to do, as traditional forms of authoritarian control would. Instead, they create informational environments that make certain choices seem more attractive, more urgent, more necessary for our personal fulfillment. They don't prohibit us from considering certain options. They simply make those options disappear from our field of vision. They don't force us to buy certain products. They just make those products appear at the exact moment when we're most vulnerable to buying them. They don't oblige us to adopt certain lifestyles. They just bombard us with carefully selected evidence that people similar to us are adopting these lifestyles and becoming happier, more fulfilled, more successful. It's a form of control that works by amplifying our own desires and insecurities, making us feel like we're making completely autonomous decisions when we are actually reacting to stimuli carefully designed to produce specific responses. The sophistication of these systems has reached a point where they can predict our future choices more accurately than we can ourselves. Through analysis of behavioral patterns from millions of similar users, algorithms develop predictive models that know what kind of person you'll likely become before you even know it yourself. They know what product you'll buy, what career you'll pursue, what kind of person you'll choose to relate to, what political beliefs you'll adopt, what existential crises you'll face at different life stages. And then they use this knowledge to create environments that accelerate your transformation in whatever direction is most profitable for the platforms. If the data indicates you'll likely go through a midlife crisis at 40, you'll start receiving content about career changes and radical adventures at 38. If patterns suggest you'll become interested in spirituality after a romantic breakup, the first suggestions for content about meditation and self-knowledge will appear right after you change your relationship status. We live in a reality where our existential crises are anticipated and monetized, where our search for authenticity is captured and directed toward commercially useful channels before we even begin to question who we really are. This phenomenon creates a paradoxical situation where we feel simultaneously unique and totally predictable. Algorithms make us feel special by personalizing every experience to our specific tastes. But this personalization is only possible because we're so predictable that our preferences can be anticipated by machines. The feeling of being understood by algorithms often satisfies us more than being understood by real people, because algorithms never judge us, never contradict us, never challenge us to grow beyond our established patterns. They simply offer us more refined and sophisticated versions of the same types of experience they already know please us. Thus, the technology that promised to expand our horizons often ends up creating increasingly comfortable and increasingly narrow bubbles where our freedom of choice is reduced to the freedom to choose between subtle variations of the same basic theme we've already demonstrated we prefer in the past. The result is that we develop a neurotic relationship with our own decisions. Every choice we make comes accompanied by an inner voice that whispers that perhaps there was a better option we didn't consider. Every path we follow is haunted by the suspicion that we could have followed a more rewarding path. Every relationship is contaminated by the fantasy that there's a more compatible person somewhere in the infinite possibilities of apps. Every job is poisoned by the idea that there is a more fulfilling career we haven't discovered yet. Every city where we live seems less interesting than all the other cities we see on social media. This is the cruelest of prisons because its chains are made of possibilities and its guards are our own dreams of a better life. We become trapped not by what is denied to us, but by the excess of what is offered to us. And the most tragic thing is that this prison is almost impossible to perceive because it disguises itself as total freedom. For most of human history, people had their identities and destinies largely determined by the circumstances of birth. You were born a peasant, you died a peasant. Born noble, died noble. Your life options were limited. But this limitation also brought a peculiar form of freedom. The freedom of not having to constantly choose everything. There was a clear structure, a defined social role, crystal clear expectations about what constituted a well-lived life within those circumstances. The medieval peasant didn't wake up every morning wondering if he should quit farming and become a merchant. He simply woke up and did the work his social position demanded. There wasn't the modern anxiety of choice, because there wasn't choice in the modern sense of the word. And while this might sound limiting by contemporary standards, it also meant that people could focus their mental energy not on constantly deciding what to do with their lives, but on how to do well what their lives demanded. There was a brutal clarity, but still a clarity about what your place in the world was and what was expected of you. The transition to modernity traded that structural certainty for the anguish of self-determination. When we dissolved the traditional structures that defined identities and destinies, we created a vacuum that each individual must now fill through constant personal choices. You're no longer born with a ready-made identity. You need to build an identity through thousands of decisions about education, career, relationships, lifestyle, beliefs, values, even personality. And this is a Herculean task for which no one adequately prepares us. We learn to value freedom of choice as the supreme good, but no one teaches us how to deal psychologically with the weight of having to constantly choose everything. The result is that many of us become overwhelmed by the responsibility of self-creating our lives and begin to feel an unconscious nostalgia for simpler and more deterministic structures. This explains the growing appeal of movements that offer absolute certainties and clearly defined roles, even when these certainties come at the cost of the individual freedom we theoretically value. The deepest irony is that our pursuit of absolute freedom often leads us to more subtle, but no less real, forms of slavery. When all external structures are removed and we are left with the responsibility of self-designing our lives, many of us unconsciously seek new forms of structure and guidance. And these new structures often come disguised as free choices. You choose to follow an influencer who dictates how to live. You choose to embrace a lifestyle prescribed by some online community. You choose to follow a productivity methodology that structures every minute of your day. You choose to adopt a life philosophy that eliminates the need to think critically about your decisions. In each case, the apparent choice masks a real abdication of the responsibility of self-determination. We trade the terrifying freedom of inventing our own lives for the comforting security of following pre-established scripts. But we make this trade through the discourse of free choice, which allows us to maintain the illusion of autonomy. Thus, our era of maximum freedom also becomes an era of voluntary conformism, where people freely choose to abdicate their freedom. The modern economy has organized itself completely around exploiting this psychological vulnerability. Entire industries exist to capitalize on our anxiety about choices and our nostalgia for simpler structures. The self-help industry sells the promise of systems that will simplify your life decisions. The coaching industry sells mentors who will make decisions for you, disguised as guidance for your own decisions. The wellness industry sells rigid routines, disguised as paths to self-realization. The productivity industry sells methodologies that structure your time so detailed they eliminate the need to decide what to do moment by moment. The relationship industry sells algorithms that promise to find your perfect match, eliminating the anxiety of having to meet people and discover compatibility through the slow and uncertain process of human experience. The career industry sells personality tests that promise to reveal your true vocation, as if there were a predetermined career waiting to be discovered rather than built through trial and error. Each of these industries profits by selling temporary relief from the anxiety of free choice. But since this relief can never be permanent in a society that demands constant self-determination, they guarantee an infinite market of consumers searching for the next solution to the burden of being free. I want to pause for a moment to ask you directly, when was the last time you felt truly comfortable with an important decision you made without imagining whether you could have made a better choice? Maybe it's rare, or maybe it's never happened in your adult life. You're not alone in this experience. Millions of people today live with this constant unease about their choices, this feeling that there's always a slightly better life we could be living if we just knew how to make the right decisions. If this feeling resonates with you, share in the comments. I feel this unease about my choices when your experience can help others realize they're not alone in this modern struggle against the weight of absolute freedom. Sometimes, naming this experience is the first step toward finding healthier ways to relate to it. The neurochemistry of the human brain did not evolve to handle infinite options. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived in small groups with relatively predictable environments and limited choices. The brain developed decision-making systems optimized for environments where options were few and the consequences of choices were clear and immediate. When you saw a predator, you had two basic options: fight or flight. When you found food, the decision was simple: eat or save. When you encountered a potential partner, the relevant variables were limited and easily accessible. The decision-making system we inherited from these ancestors works well when options are few and variables are simple, but collapses when bombarded with complex choice scenarios involving hundreds of interdependent variables and consequences that extend decades into the future. When we try to use this ancestral system to decide between 200 college majors or 1,000 career options or thousands of potential partners, it simply crashes. The result is the choice paralysis many experience and the chronic anxiety that accompanies the feeling of constantly making important decisions with mental tools inadequate for the task. This mismatch between our ancestral mental architecture and the demands of modern life creates a phenomenon we could call decision fatigue, where the mere act of constantly choosing between multiple options dramatically depletes our mental energy. Neurological studies show that the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for complex decision-making, consumes a disproportionate amount of glucose when forced to process many choices in sequence. It's literally as if each decision burns mental fuel, and in a society that forces us to make hundreds of micro decisions per day, from which app to open when we wake up to which series to watch before sleeping, we arrive at the end of the day mentally exhausted, not from having done something productive, but simply from having constantly chosen between unnecessarily multiple options. This fatigue is not a luxury of privileged people, but a reality that affects everyone, from the executive deciding between business strategies to the family mother choosing between dozens of cereal brands at the supermarket. The democracy of infinite choices has become an equal tyranny for all social levels. The situation becomes even more absurd when we realize that many of the options among which we spend mental energy deciding are artificially created to generate the illusion of personalization without offering real substantial differences. The industry discovered that consumers feel more satisfied when they believe they're making personalized choices, even when these choices are cosmetic. That's why we have 30 flavors of toothpaste that are essentially the same product with small irrelevant variations, 200 smartphone models that do fundamentally the same functions, 1,000 online courses that promise to teach the same skills with slightly different methodologies. We spend precious time and mental energy distinguishing between differences that were deliberately created to be small enough not to matter, but large enough to give us the feeling that we're exercising our autonomy. It's a cruel form of theater where we play the role of free consumers while companies profit both from selling the products and from selling the feeling that we are free to choose between them. More disturbing still is how this excess of trivial choices distracts us from really important decisions we could be making about how to organize our societies. While we spend 40 minutes deciding what to order on Uber Eats, we don't dedicate 40 minutes thinking about how our city's public policies affect our quality of life, while we exhaustively research which online course to take to improve our career. We don't research how educational systems could be reformed to work better for everyone. While we obsessively compare different meditation apps, we don't think critically about how our society could be reorganized to be less stressful from the start. The excess of individual choices functioned as a smokescreen that prevents us from seeing that many of the problems we try to solve through personal choices are actually systemic problems that require collective solutions. individual freedom of choice became a substitute for collective freedom of social self-determination. And this was one of the most ingenious tricks of neoliberal ideology, convincing us that we can solve all problems through consumer choices, when in fact many problems require political choices that can only be made collectively. Besides this, the human brain has an evolutionary tendency to focus more intensely on losses than on gains, a bias that psychologists call loss aversion. In the era of limited choices, this bias protected us from unnecessary risks. It was better to be overly cautious about losing what you had than to risk everything for uncertain gains. But in the era of infinite possibilities, this same tendency becomes a source of torment. Every choice we make is not just a decision about what to gain, but a decision about what to lose. When you choose a career, you're simultaneously rejecting hundreds of other possible careers. When you choose a partner, you're rejecting thousands of other potential partners. And since the brain is programmed to feel losses more intensely than gains, every choice comes accompanied by a sensation of multiple loss that can be psychologically devastating. You may be living an objectively good life, but feel chronically dissatisfied because your mind is focused not on what you gained through your choices, but on everything you lost by not making all the other possible choices. This situation becomes even more complicated when we consider that our perception of available options is being constantly manipulated by algorithms designed to maximize engagement and not well-being. The recommendation systems that determine what we see online are not programmed to show us the options that would make us happier in the long term, but rather the options that will keep us connected to platforms longer in the short term. This means we are systematically exposed to exaggerated and romanticized versions of alternative lives, alternative careers, alternative relationships. The algorithm won't show you the mundane and frustrating aspects of the influencer's life who travels the world, but only the peak moments that generate more engagement. It won't show you the financial difficulties and uncertainty of the successful entrepreneur, but only the final glamorous results. It won't show you the conflicts and compromises necessary in relationships that seem perfect online, but only the curated moments that generate more likes. The result is that we develop completely unrealistic expectations about how alternative lives are lived, which makes our own real life, with all its normal complexities and imperfections, seem inferior in comparison. Paradoxically, the more options we theoretically have available, the more conformist we become in practice. This happens because the excess of choices creates such intense anxiety that we unconsciously seek shortcuts to reduce this anxiety. And the most available shortcuts are to follow what everyone else is doing or follow what some authority recommends. Thus, in an era where we supposedly can completely personalize our lives, we observe a strange homogenization of lifestyles, especially among younger people. Everyone wants to be unique in exactly the same way. Everyone follows the same alternative career trends. Everyone adopts the same minimalist lifestyles. Everyone embraces the same self-realization philosophies. The illusion of mass personalization masks a reality of mass conformism because people overwhelmed with infinite options naturally gravitate towards solutions that diminish the cognitive load of constant decision-making, and these solutions often involve following pre-established models that are popular precisely because they reduce choice anxiety. The deeper question is not how to have more options, but how to develop a healthier relationship with the options we already have. And this requires a fundamental change in how we understand freedom and choice. Instead of seeing freedom as maximizing available options, we can begin to see it as the ability to make conscious choices and then be at peace with those choices. Instead of valuing the theoretical possibility of being able to change everything at any moment, we can value the ability to commit deeply to the choices we make. This doesn't mean passively accepting any situation, but means distinguishing between changes that would really improve our life experience and changes that are just fantasist escapism from the responsibility of living deeply the choices we've already made. True freedom may lie not in having infinite options, but in knowing when to stop looking for options and start living intensely the possibilities we've already chosen to explore. Traditional cultures developed rituals and social structures that help people commit deeply to their life choices. Rites of passage marked important transitions and created a sense of finality that made it harder to constantly question decisions already made. Community structures provided external validation for roles and life choices, reducing the need for constant validation through comparison with alternatives. Philosophical and spiritual traditions offered frameworks for understanding that a well-lived life doesn't come from maximizing options, but from cultivating wisdom, deep relationships, and purpose within any set of circumstances. We don't need to return to these traditional structures, which often came with their own forms of oppression, but we can learn from them about how to create psychological stability amid constant change. In our era, we need to consciously develop what we could call arts of voluntary limitation. This includes learning to establish healthy limits on how many options we consider in different areas of life. It means developing clear criteria for decision-making that allow us to choose quickly and move forward instead of ruminating infinitely about alternatives. It means practicing the discipline of stopping consumption of content that feeds our fantasy about alternative lives and focusing our attention on the life we're actually living. It means cultivating deep relationships that help us feel rooted in something real instead of always seeking the next experience or opportunity. And perhaps most importantly, it means developing a personal philosophy that helps us distinguish between changes that serve our real growth and changes that are just ways to avoid the responsibility of committing deeply to anything. But these individual solutions, while necessary, are not sufficient to face a problem that is fundamentally systemic. The epidemic of choice anxiety is not just a matter of personal development, but a symptom of how we organize our society and our economy. We need to begin questioning whether a system that artificially multiplies options to generate profit through constant dissatisfaction is compatible with human well-being in the long term. This means rethinking everything from basic education, which could teach decision-making skills and tolerance for limitation, to urban policies which could create environments that facilitate healthy choices instead of multiplying unnecessary options. It means questioning an economic model that treats the multiplication of choices as automatic progress, regardless of the impact on people's real quality of life. The social reorganization necessary to solve this problem would involve recognizing that not every choice is an improvement and that well-designed systems often work better when they consciously limit available options to optimize for specific outcomes instead of maximizing abstract variety. Cities that intelligently restrict transportation options to prioritize walking and public transport often offer better quality of life than cities that maximize all possible locomotion options. Educational systems that offer well-structured learning paths often produce better results than systems that offer infinite possibilities for personalization. Work environments that establish clear protocols for communication and decision-making are often more productive and less stressful than environments that maximize flexibility and autonomy in all micro decisions. The challenge lies in distinguishing between oppressive limitations that serve power and liberating limitations that serve human well-being. The former are imposed from outside and benefit some at the expense of others. The latter are chosen collectively and benefit everyone through reducing unnecessary cognitive load. The crucial difference lies in the process. Liberating limitations emerge from democratic deliberation about how to organize collective life to maximize human flourishing, while oppressive limitations are imposed by those who benefit from the status quo. Thus, the solution to excess freedom is not less freedom, but a more mature form of freedom that includes the collective capacity to consciously choose our limitations. The future of human freedom may depend on our ability to redefine what freedom means in an era of infinite possibilities. If we continue defining freedom as maximizing options, we will continue creating societies that produce chronic anxiety and perpetual dissatisfaction. But if we can evolve our understanding of freedom to include the ability to consciously choose our limitations and then flourish within those limitations, we can create a human life experience that is simultaneously free and satisfying. This requires courage because it means giving up the fantasy that we can have everything and be anything, and accepting that a well-lived life inevitably involves choosing some possibilities and rejecting others. But this courage can free us in a deeper way than any multiplication of options could achieve. It can free us from the tyranny of always wanting to be somewhere else, being someone else, living another life. If these reflections have touched on something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't found words to express, know that you're not alone. This struggle with the weight of absolute freedom is one of the most common experiences of our era, although it's rarely discussed openly. By subscribing to this channel, you'll connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical and psychological challenges of living authentically in the modern world. Each week, we meet here to explore together the big questions that define our era and to seek not just understanding, but also wiser and freer ways to exist amid the complexities of contemporary life. This is not just a channel, but a space for collective reflection about how we can live with more wisdom, more peace, and more real purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented by the infinite possibilities it offers. Join us in this continuous journey of discovery. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to transform the burden of absolute freedom into the blessing of a consciously chosen and deeply lived life.
When I write a book, I would sometimes try to imagine my reader. And I usually base my imagined reader either on myself or on people I actually know, or on encounters I had with students at university or public events or interviews. But this is a very limited pool of examples of data. When I'm doing it, maybe I have a kind of pool of information on a couple of hundred people. The AI that would write the book or the piece of music, it would have data on millions and billions of human beings over time. If the goal is to create a certain state of mind for other people, I just don't see how we can compete with the AI on that, especially as it will also have the advantage of being able to tailor the book, the song specifically to different people.
This extremely cynical view of humans is not true. Yes, humans are interested in power to some extent in some situations, but this is not the only thing that we want. We are not power-crazy demons. If you look at yourself, start with yourself. Mm-hmm. If I look at myself, do I want power in life? Yes, in some situations I want. This is not the only thing. I really want to know the truth about myself, my life, the world. And the key reason for that is that if you don't know the truth about yourself, you can never be happy. Because you don't know what are the sources of misery in your life, and you can't solve them.
Another story is about Tiberius, the Roman Emperor Tiberius. He was afraid to be assassinated, like all emperors. Unfortunately for him, the commander of his bodyguard, Sejanus, was an extremely ambitious person also. Sejanus convinced Tiberius to move to live on the small island of Capri, telling Tiberius that there he will be safer, because it will be easier to protect him against assassins and spies and so forth. And Tiberius moved to live in Capri. But then Sejanus controlled all the information that reached the emperor. It was very easy for him. But nobody could get to Capri. No letter could reach the emperor unless it passed through the hands of the bodyguards. And Sejanus became the real ruler of the Roman Empire because he controlled all the information reaching Tiberius. And if somebody tried to make a move against him, he could always tell Tiberius that this person was conspiring against him or was a threat and should be eliminated. And to some extent, this is true of all of us. All of us can find ourselves isolated on an island, maybe a digital island, and whoever controls the information that reaches our ears and eyes control us.